And good morning to the SICFARO President. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, as well as the SICFARO team, the head of the Auditor General, the provincial departments, the public entities, and all stakeholders that are part of this event today. It is my privilege to present to you on this very big topic which I hope I will do justice to in the limited time we have this morning, but hopefully would make a difference to impact what you've just heard and to be able to address some of the issues that the AGS has raised in her presentation. So whilst we acknowledge that there has been significant progress in terms of audit opinions, audit outcomes, as well as even to a certain extent internal controls, it's very clear from the presentation that we've heard this morning that we still need to do quite a bit of work, as our program director has indicated, as well as ensure that the poor audit outcomes and contributions we address in terms of the challenges that South Africa is facing. The combination of weak controls, lack of transparency, and inefficiencies can unfortunately open doors for fraudulent activities to take place and the misuse of public funds. I think internal audit and internal control functions play a critical role in terms of improving audit outcomes and enhancing preventative controls to safeguard corruption in the public sector. The functions also serve as key mechanisms for promoting transparency, accountability, and efficiency in using public funds. I'm sure if you open the newspaper this morning, you're going to see some topic or some conversation around corruption in the country that's been prevalent. The fundamental objective of internal audit and internal control functions is to strengthen governance and financial integrity. That is what internal audit officials are tasked to do, as well as what our internal controls should be implemented to be able to promote financial integrity. So I thought I would begin the presentation by just explaining the difference between internal control functions and internal audit. So from an internal audit point of view, we must understand that an internal audit provides us independent assurance that in terms of the effectiveness of risk management, internal controls, as well as governance in terms of processes, whereas an internal control function is a set of processes, policies, and procedures that we design internally in organization to prevent errors, fraud, and ensure that we have operational efficiency. The objective is to evaluate, in terms of internal audit, is to evaluate the effectiveness of risk management, control, and governance, whereas internal control ensures that we must have operational efficiency, financial integrity, and compliance with regulations. I think for me, one of the biggest differences is on the responsibility. Internal audit conducts independent audits and assessments. They also report to senior management and audit committees and other governance structures. But internal control is implemented by management. So that's you and I sitting in this room here today, who are responsible for day-to-day operations, and we need to ensure that internal controls are implemented on a daily basis. So I think in a nutshell, you get the difference between internal controls versus internal audit. And we often see internal controls to be an audit function, and we often see internal controls as a separate process that needs to be followed away from our day-to-day management. And I think it's about time that we understand that every one of us who work in a government environment is responsible for internal controls, and to make sure that on a day-to-day basis we're actually implementing it and being able to address it. Preventative measures comes from us in terms of internal control implementation. Internal audit, their role would be to help you identify these issues or weaknesses and provide guidance in terms of fraud detection, compliance with laws and regulations, and efficiency of internal controls. But the safeguarding of assets, the accuracy of records, that rests with us as management in terms of an internal control environment. Now, in provincial departments as well as your public entities, we are seeing more and more establishments of an internal control function. So in addition to having your internal audit team, you also have what's called an internal control team. And that internal control team has a number of responsibilities allocated to it. One of it is to manage effective and efficient and transparent financial management controls, management of financial losses and loss control, management of financial systems to make sure that we are implementing controls, supporting with management in terms of fraud prevention, as well as maintaining governance frameworks and participation in committees, etc. Now, from my experience, having worked at the provincial level with provincial departments, as well as now outside of provincial treasury, we've seen that internal control has become a routine function. We've seen internal control being a tick box exercise that we put this through to say, yes, can we just make sure that we've got 3 quotations, that we've paying the correct supplier, etc. But it's not necessarily a proactive approach to say, what are we doing to actually change the day-to-day basis? If we pick up a weakness, what are we doing to correct it? And I think that is a change that we need to see in government, to say, as officials who are going through numerous payment vouchers and numerous procurement processes, are we standing up and saying, we've got a problem here and we need to fix this? And how do we prevent it from occurring in the future so that it needs to get there? So internal control has to become independent. And I know in terms of the structures currently they do report to the CFO or to the financial management function. But we do need them to have an independent ability to be able to assess the situation and make the correct decision, and not just process the transaction because somebody signed off on that. The fact that we must have independent judgment and the ability to express our own opinions and control is critical for us to be able to stand in this day and age and address the big monster in the room, which is fraud and corruption. Many departments and entities have established a separate unit, like we've said, and we must understand that this internal control unit is actually important, because without that, we can live in the false hope of clean audit and being under the impression that we've done everything correctly. So it's important that we start off with strengthening our internal controls. And remember, I said internal controls is you and I. It's the people that process transactions on a day-to-day basis. Yes, we may have a separate unit that we've established, and their role would be to then oversee what we've done and to validate it prior to transactions going through. But as CFOs, as HUDs, as key people in the finance management processes, what role are we playing to be able to ensure we can address audit outcomes? One of the audit outcomes we need to address is irregular expenditure. The UIFW in this country is alarming. I mean, if you heard the numbers that the AG presented this morning, that is money that we could be utilizing more effectively for service delivery. Now, please hear me correctly. I'm not saying that all irregular expenditure is corruption. It could not be that. But there is a very likelihood that there would be a level of material loss linked to it, or there would be a level of corruption, or a level where we could have done things better from efficiency point of view. And for that reason, it's important that we pay attention and we work towards reducing this in the country. The first thing we need to do is ensure that there's technical training and competence. Now, as finance people, we tend to stay abreast of the latest accounting standards. What is the modified cash standard requiring me to do? What is GRAP if I'm a public entity that's requiring me to do? But in addition to that, our internal control unit, the individuals that are sitting and looking at these payment vouchers and these procurement processes, do they understand what they're supposed to be doing on a day-to-day basis? Do they understand the latest changes that have come through? And what about the practical training behind that? Because yes, theoretically I may understand it, but practically, do I know how to implement it? I often say to trainees that I've met along the way is that if you are not able to do yourself, you cannot audit, you cannot play oversight, you cannot express an opinion unless you learn how to do. So we must learn and make sure that the people we've put in place to be able to play our oversight role or to be able to safeguard our resources actually understand how to do. Legislative frameworks may change, we need to know what that is. Record management. How many of us still live in the stone age of manual record management, manual payment vouchers, manual document management systems, where we have archives and acres of documents. And now when AG wants to find a document, we can't find it because we don't know where to work through or where to get to. Records are intentionally going missing in government. And I say this very boldly because I've seen it happen. Intentionally, records are going missing. And this is because somebody's taken a payment voucher home, somebody's gone to, doesn't want something to be found or looked at further, and therefore that is why we're in a situation where we don't have records when we need them. We need to have effective storage and retrieval. And yes, that's going to mean automation. It's the only way we can safeguard our data to make sure that it's accessible and that it's available when we need it to be able to support transactions. If the Hawks, the SIU, or any of the other stakeholders come in to investigate, do we have the documents to give them to be able to conclude on it? And if we're really serious about corruption and we really want to change the view, we have to move towards automation and being able to entrench these things on a daily basis. We need to foster a culture of accountability and integrity. Ethical training has become fundamental in government. And I'm not just talking about a 2-hour presentation where you sit and you listen to somebody speaking to you about ethics. I'm speaking about extensive ethic training where people are taught. Remember, we all come from different backgrounds. We come from different cultures. We come from different beliefs and systems. And what may be normal for one person may be abnormal for another. And therefore, we need to go through the process of understanding exactly what ethics mean. How do we handle situations where we have to apply judgment? How do we know the difference between right and wrong? And we need to also recognize, and I think this is we're not doing much in government around this, is the ability to recognize employees who are doing well in adhering to controls. I'm not talking about big fancy performance bonuses, etc. I'm talking about giving an employee recognition for picking up something, for standing firm on a decision and not allowing something to take place and speaking up on their concerns and challenges. And that's where we need to go to in terms of government. We need to invest in technology. The AG this morning also alluded in a presentation around the fact that we have ancient technology. We have technology you cannot upgrade, technology you cannot use the latest software tools on. And if we're really serious about dealing with corruption, we need to invest in technology. Departments, unfortunately, are very much behind when you look at municipal financial systems and you compare what departments have. We're very far behind. And unless we get to that point where we're on par or even better, we are going to constantly have challenges where we're dealing with thousands and millions and billions of transactions, and you're not going to be able to pick up everything that we should be picking up because we don't have technology in place to assist us. The review in terms of processes, in terms of process-driven activities. In our environment, we have what's called standard operating procedures, and all of you at department level would have standard operating procedures. How many of us review it? When last did you see a standard operating procedure document in your department? When last did you check whether it was updated in line with the latest requirements, the legislation changes, the MCS frameworks, and all the gaps and the risk assessments that we do quarterly after every quarter? Where does that information go? Because if anything, it's supposed to be feeding into business processes, policies, and procedures, because I should be enhancing. Business processes need to become living documents. It needs to be documents that I can consistently update to be able to address my loopholes, that people constantly look at it and evaluate and sign off to be able to get there. The level of scrutiny in terms of day-to-day operations. Does a transaction make sense? That's a logical question. If I was to do this in my own home, will I go out in procurement in this way? If I want to appoint a contractor, is what I'm doing making sense? From a financial perspective, from a process perspective, to be able to then play that kind of oversight. Detailed review of documentation and validity. I've just recently read an article where one of our provincial departments had supply collusion taking place because the bank account details was the same of all 3 suppliers that submitted the quotation, or the tender. So no matter who got the work, the same people are benefiting. And nobody picked it up. It went through all the different evaluations, it went through internal control, it went all the way up to bid adjudication. Nobody picked it up. And that is the concerns we have, because now, one, we're doing manual. Secondly is if somebody picked it up and doesn't report it, there's no way anyone else will be able to know about it because it's manual. I was speaking to the level of scrutiny that we need to have in terms of operations. that there needs to be logical actions and the detailed review of documentation and validity to be able to ensure that we're able to place the level of scrutiny and oversight, which means that as officials, we need to have integrity, we need to have honesty, we need to have commitment in order to have these dates, the scrutiny to be displayed in that regard. The other factor that I want to highlight this morning is the monthly reconciliations and registers. Now, this seems like a simple thing to do, to be able to reconcile your creditors, to reconcile your debtors, etc. But what we found is that organizations that fail to produce a creditors recon are organizations that are paying suppliers without following required processes. The same with debtors. If I'm not able to produce a debtors recon, chances are I'm not billing all my debtors that I should be billing. So there's a direct link between monthly reconciliations and actually identifying weak controls and the impact that it may have on even possibly fraud and corruption as well, because there could be intentional reasons why we're not reconciling creditors and etc. The proactive internal audit involvement also needs to be in place. So when we have an internal control environment, there needs to be a close working relationship between the internal control teams as well as the internal audit teams to ensure that high-risk matters can be escalated to internal audit. So they may find things that are of concern or things that may result in issues. They may want validity on high-value tenders before being appointed. So apart from just internal control, they should be able to flag that and escalate that in terms of internal audit, as well as payments that's being made. So that working relationship needs to be in place to be able to escalate that accordingly. Now, looking at internal audit looks at technical training and competence firstly. We now know that from an internal audit environment, we need to implement the global audit standards, which is issued internationally for us to then adhere to. So the global audit standards is what we should be implementing in our environment. We also look at accounting standards, legislative frameworks, and practical training. In my experience, we see a lot of internal auditors that don't have the technical knowledge. And when I say technical knowledge, again, like I indicated earlier, you cannot audit, you cannot review something if you yourself cannot do. So if I don't understand how to do a creditors recon, I could put anything on the table, and as long as it balances to my general ledger or my trial balance, then the auditors would accept it. And that's not the environment we're wanting. That's not the culture we want. And we find that a lot of the issues that internal audit doesn't pick up is because they didn't understand those issues. So when AG comes into audit, they pick up those issues that internal audit should have picked up. So are we exposing our internal audit team to the latest technical training around modified cash, GRAP, accounting frameworks, legislation, etc.? And I'll be giving them the practical training to support them. The next thing, again, is technology. So from an internal audit environment, we have really good audit management systems in place that's in the country that can be sourced. That audit management system will actually be able to manage volumes of data and be able to give you your high-risk transactions, and compare from year to year. The AI tools that we're now living with in South Africa is really advanced. And I don't think we've explored that enough to be able to understand how much of value that those tools can bring to us from an audit level. The continuous monitoring of controls and compliance in terms of actively monitoring the implementation of controls and compliance. AG alluded to this earlier by saying that in our environment, the controls that we have in place is not effective enough to be able to pick up non-compliance. And that's, for example, because we just don't know. We don't know that we must award tenders inclusive of VAT, as a simple example. And yet the legislation tells us that. So these are things that we need to pay attention to be able to avoid this. We need to strengthen the role of audit committees. Now, I'm an audit committee chairperson myself, and I would say to you that in my audit committee role, I often get requests from other organizations say, please, can you come join this audit committee, because we're not getting the technical skill we need from the audit committee that needs to be in place. So the question I have is, what processes do we have to appoint those audit committee people? How have we evaluated those audit committee people to even be there in the first place to be able to give us that kind of guidance? And again, we should be leading the agenda. We normally sit as audit committee and go through routine audit reports or routine management reports. It gives us the same thing with updated numbers from month to month. The question is, is that adding value? Are you focusing on the right issues? Are you looking at where we've deviated in terms of suppliers and the reasons why we've deviated from those suppliers? Are we looking at the awards made? Because every committee should be different. Every agenda should be different in terms of our meetings that focuses on different items. We also, as internal auditors, need to test business process changes, policies, and SOPs. Is it working for us, or do we need to do something better? And how are we also dealing with root cause analysis? Okay. Now, AG does a root cause analysis. But again, remember, the AG is looking at it from an outside point of view into your organization. You as an organization still have the responsibility to do your own root cause analysis. Is AG's recommendations and root causes correct? Or maybe the root cause is something different that we need to now explore internally to be able to get there. Mock audits, surprise testing, auditing of interim financials, these are key things that we need to be doing as internal audit to be able to strengthen it. And the utilization of external auditors' insights like we've had this morning is key to improve internal audit processes. In my engagements with the AG team, they often say to me that the reason why we can't replace reliance on internal audit work is because the methodology they use doesn't align to what we are utilizing. So why is that? Why can't we not, share ideas and skills to say, can we not look at methodologies together? Can we not understand where our weaknesses are? Can we not assess findings and look at recommendations? And then be able to then link it. A lot of it is because our internal audit is not technical. And if we get them to the level of understanding what accounting disclosures need to be and what processes need to be, then we should be able to strengthen that. So now with the big topic, challenges in preventing corruption. Okay, so if I looked back at the slide last night and I said, if I had to put 4 points down, what would be those 4 points? And this is the result of it. Okay, the first thing is that because we are processing volumes of transactions on a daily basis, manual processes is not going to work. It's not going to stop us from dealing with corruption. We have outdated controls. We have inadequate risk assessments that take place. So when a risk assessment is done, it's done simply because of compliance. We need to submit a quarterly risk assessment report. Let's just do this. We're not sitting in the room and asking us, what are we doing wrong? How do we stop this from occurring? How do we prevent fraud from the bank taking place? How do we deal with the fact that there may be collusion amongst suppliers? Are we having those kind of conversations? And are we talking about what kind of controls that we need to be putting in place? Insider fraud and procurement manipulation. So again, we know that corruption is not just service providers alone. We know that it's officials, businesses, and to a large extent, criminals intentionally working together to further their interests. And no matter what level we look at it, unless we start dealing with that and putting in controls to deal with this, it becomes very difficult to root out corruption, because the people at the top itself are sometimes hiding the corruption intentionally. There needs to be independence, or at least as it stands now, we also have limited independence of internal audit. If I had to ask many of the internal audit practitioners, how have we dealt with issues where we found potential fraud and corruption? Many of them will say we've never reported it, or we've kept quiet about it, because there is a political level of interference, there is pressure, there's intimidation, there's fear of retaliation to be able to report this. And unless we get proper whistleblower protection systems in place, we're not going to see a change in this to be able to move forward. We also have insufficient resources and expertise in the sense that we have understaffing. Because of cost containment measures, we don't have the required people in place. We have budget constraints, so we have lack of specialized skill to be able to make the correct decisions. And there is an over-reliance on manual processes in place. So the Institute of Internal Auditors issued this, I think it was really in 2013, or if not earlier, but it's called the 3 Lines of Defense Model. So in other words, and it was issued in the context of risk management, but I thought it was relevant to actually corruption as well. Because if you think about it, the first line of defense in any organization is your internal control. And remember, I said internal control is management, our day-to-day officials, who are responsible for preventing and detecting fraud. So the the billions of the 43 billion rand worth of irregular expenditure this morning that has taken place, I can say the first line of defense has failed. For it to have reached that stage, first line of defense has failed. And then we need to ask ourselves, what about the second line of defense? We have risk management and compliance functions that's supposed to be in place, where they're monitoring and providing oversight to be able to identify potential risks around these contracts and et cetera. And the third line of defense is internal audit. So if all three of these defense mechanisms fail, then we don't have a defense mechanism for corruption in government. That's what it means. If all three can still allow corruption to take place. And remember, yes, there will be certain elements of corruption you cannot pick up at this level, and I agree. But if you look at the billions of rands that we see reported in the newspaper, you got to ask yourself, how did it get through all three without being raised to be able to get there? So in terms of preventative controls, effective procurement controls need to be in place, okay? And I want us to think about automated procurement processes. Currently in government, we submit tenders manually. Why can we not do the tender system electronically? Why can we not have suppliers who submit information electronically? Because there's advantages with it, because if I'm submitting as a tender as a company and somebody else is submitting the tender as a company, the system will immediately pick up that we've got the same banking details, or we've got the same directors, or we've got the same address. It doesn't have to be a manual process to be able to get there and to look at the volumes. So what are we doing to evaluate or implement those checks? Integrated e-procurement systems must be linked with vendor rating. National Treasury has what's called a blacklisting register now, and according to them, and I've had various discussions with National Treasury on this regulations project, but according to them, the reasons why vendors are not getting blacklisted is because we as departments and municipalities and government as a whole are not reporting them. So Treasury doesn't have enough evidence to blacklist somebody because we are not raising issues around poor performance. And if we start doing that, we could be able to link this. Vendors, contractors, and public sector service suppliers needs to be rated on transparency, ethical behavior, and past performance. Okay? And I say this as a service provider myself. We need to be rated on whether we are ethical, whether we are transparent in our processes, whether we are able to produce based on past performance. Supplier due diligence to prevent conflicts of interest, transparency, and independent oversight as well. So again, I think AG alluded to the fact that we're not doing due diligence on suppliers. We're just appointing. We're going through the evaluation process and we're appointing. But again, we need to look at conflicts of interest, transparency, and independent oversight. And unless we move to electronic systems again, it's going to be difficult to pick up on those things. Whistleblower protection and ethical governance. So yes, we have whistleblower systems in place, but I would think that we are now in ability to be able to look at AI. There's something called chat boxes, where bots as well, where it's not another human behind it, it's an automated process, and you can actually report fraud and corruption through that process. In addition to that, you'll be able to upload evidence which can be encrypted and you cannot trace your location. I was reading an article where News 24 has now implemented this for their whistleblower protection services. So we as government need to start exploring this. Ethical training and development of officials, and we've spoken about this. And again, I'm going to steal AG's words here by looking at culture shift. Culture shift is key. Because if we don't understand why we do a job at the end of the day, we're never going to get to that point where we're going to see a deep level of responsibility in officials. Are we passionate? Are we dedicated? Do we want to serve? Those are the questions we should be asking ourselves. AI, fraud detection, and predictive analysis. So with the AI tools that's available, there are systems that can actually analyze large volumes of financial transactions which will detect anomalies and patterns. Are you awarding the same supplier for years and years and years? Are you awarding processes in a certain way? Using predictive and analytics to do risk scores in terms of transactions, employees, and vendors, and linking this. Blockchain is also one of the key things, and this will be more towards latest technology. I think the point to understand here is we cannot do all of this if we stay on the same systems that we have in government. We have to look at upgrading and looking at new systems that we can use. But blockchain technology also ensures that transactions cannot be manipulated. In the public sector space, we've seen creditor supplier details in terms of bank accounts being changed and transactions being processed and supply details being changed back again. And it looks like a supply is being paid, but it's not. It's actually somebody else's bank account. So those are things that we need to start looking at, because things like blockchain can prevent this from occurring. Contract execution. Automation of contract execution is something that I think we need to start thinking about, ensuring that payments are only released by verification of completed milestones that's validated and linked to it. The biometrics and behavioral access controls. I know from a department level, we do have fingerprint recognition in place in terms of releasing payments, but I'm not sure to a public entity level as to how much we've explored that to make sure that the correct people have been releasing transactions. A situation which you all would have seen was a local municipality recently in the newspaper who had monies that were taken from their bank account, and even though they didn't process the transactions themselves. And again, it comes back to things like fingerprint recognition that could have been in place to save that. Tracker user behavior and financial systems, unusual login times, irregular transactions. These are things we should be looking at already and dealing with. Forensic auditing in real-time transactions. Every internal auditor needs to at some point embrace forensic auditing. Not to the sense that you need to become a forensic auditor yourself, but you need to learn the skill, you need to learn the concepts, so that when you are auditing, you can actually embed that in your audit processes to be able to identify and flag suspicious transactions. Cross-check employee bank accounts, vendor lists, and payroll records. Payroll records for the government as a country versus supplier records versus vendor lists. We have all of the information. We're not using it because we don't have systems to be able to link all of this. Another contentious one, which I can dream to have, is the geotagging of service delivery in terms of goods or services being delivered. How do I know that I have water? I'm sending out a supplier to deliver water to the rural community. How do I know that it's physically delivered? How do I know that he really took a water tank to that community and made sure water was provided? So geotagging is actually one of the key things. The same with goods in terms of building of infrastructure projects. We often go on the ground and we see projects that are not there, but we've paid for them. So geotagging is obviously something. Fleet management, and I think with the tracking systems we have, this should already be in place in terms of where we're looking at unauthorized use of fuel and records, but nobody's analyzing it because it requires manual printouts, manual assessment of data. We need to have systems that can automatically do this. And the link to performance management and validation processes is also key to be able to make sure that performance management and is linked throughout the process of the project. We shouldn't get halfway through the project and then realize that we're not happy with the service of the supplier. We should be able to pick that up as and when the project is being implemented. Lastly is digital conflict of interest declarations. When I was in provincial treasury, I remember that as senior management, we were required to do it electronically. I'm not sure if we've been able to escalate it to all public sector officials. And for me, that's one of the things that I think if we've not done, we must be able to do. Because ultimately, if I'm able to do that together with the details of my spouses, the AG's findings will not happen where we've awarded contracts to people who are in the supply of the state. And until we get there, we're not going to get that. And again, to link it back to vendors, because on the forms, they do declare, but not all vendors are honest. Let's be real about it. So again, we have to make sure that we have systems in place to be able to identify that. Lastly, colleagues, I want to just end off with these last words. As fraud and corruption schemes evolve, public sector has to adopt proactive and innovative preventative controls to detect and prevent irregularities. It's very clear from the AG's presentation and what you've heard this morning that traditional internal controls are no longer sufficient. So what we learned in school to do is the past. Yes, it's taught us the foundation, but now we need to think to the future. and see how we're going to be able to do this. Emerging technologies such as AI, blockchain, biometrics, and real-time analytics will get us a long way in terms of enhancing preventative controls and enable proactive fraud detection. And integrating these with strong ethical governance from you and I and accountability will strengthen anti-corruption efforts, no matter what level it takes place. And lastly, now is the time to embrace innovative thinking if we want to change the sector, and to ensure that we're able to explore these options, put pressure on the right people to be able to help us get there, and to be able to be voiceful in eliminating fraud and corruption. I thank you. Okay.